from my own experience, I did not find the argument of arbitrary goodness particularly convincing, nor did I find most of the arguments that I encountered against the veracity or value of this process convincing. So, full speed ahead. I cannot speak with any certainty to universal properties or universal qualities regarding this process, but in comparing notes with other people who've undertaken a similar intellectual journey, despair does seem to be a very common quality. And an intensity of despair which gradually wanes not due to the dissipation of despair, but due to the dissipation of intensity. Now this is the key. If someone was engaged in this process to unravel the yarn of a particular truth, if they were engaged in this process because they believed that a certain idea or a certain range of ideas or a certain kind of ideas were built on these arbitrary propositions, and they wanted that to fall, they may well stop. They may well reach a point where they just stop. The most common rock bottom that many people describe is just this state of absolute nihilism wherein one says all proposition is arbitrary, there is no meaning, deconstruction has annihilated all. That in breaking things into smaller parts we are left with nothing but dust. And in breaking down the dust we have nothing. We have nothing. Nothing remains. And what's particularly interesting to me is that I have only encountered a handful of people who then did, for me, what was the next rational step. If I got here by breaking things down into smaller components, if I got here by doubting the validity of my assumptions, at this point, I don't have many left, but I still do have some. I still do have some. Deconstruction itself is a proposition. Skepticism is a proposition. And having already broken down the innateness of language, the coherence of language, having broken these things down already, and recognizing that rigorous application of process, on the one hand, demands that we go forward, on the other hand, itself is an arbitrary proposition, we find ourselves in an instant stalemate. Process itself, deconstruction itself, skepticism itself, if we have fed it, if we have fed them all that we have to feed them, eventually we must feed them to themselves. And I've only met a few people who have described what it felt like to do that. And there was for me, just a void, just a perfect void. One of the best examples of this, and one of the few times where I think a moment from a movie outdoes the moment from the book that it was based on. Nick Nolte in the film adaptation of Kurt Vonnegut's Mother Night. There is a point at which the character has no reason to do anything. No reason to do anything at all. So he just stops on this one patch of New York sidewalk and stands there for a day. It's not an act of determination. It's not an act of... it is not an expression of despair. It is that in the absence of purpose, all forces are equivalently influential, and all motivations which would draw him in a given direction are counteracted by another. So the total influence zeroes out. He has no reason to move. And that's much what it felt like. That is much what that final step felt like. There was no despair left. There was no anguish. Certainly not the lingering resentment and frustration at the meaninglessness of it all. There was just nothing. And yet there wasn't. And this is the curious thing. This is the very curious thing, and this is uniform among the people with whom I've compared notes on this. There was something yet there. After a rejection of the notion of the existence of self, a rejection of the notion of the existence of consciousness, a rejection of the notion of the rejection of notions, of rejection of notions, there was yet something there. And against that, with that, to that, I was entirely helpless. I cannot assign word to it, I cannot assign definition to it, I cannot describe its properties, because all of those tools have already been broken down into component parts, which were eventually broken down into dust, which was eventually broken down into nothing. After all of that, I find myself naked in the abyss, with no real conviction to the existence of myself, an abyss, existing in. And there was yet something there.